Hi everyone, my name is Kim Gi-hwan and welcome to my course on learning about formal language in Korean. Now, Korea is a highly hierarchical society. So whenever Korean people meet, they instantly form a hierarchy. So some people become our peers, some people become our superiors, and some are below us in the hierarchy. And depending on who we're speaking to, it's important to use appropriate and respectful language, particularly when we're speaking to those who are higher up in the hierarchy. So in this course, we'll learn how hierarchies are established in different contexts, such as in families, at work, and at school. And we'll also learn the important role age plays in establishing hierarchy in Korea, and how Korea uses a different age system. We'll learn what formal and honorific language is, and how they are used in different situations with different people. We'll then look at different kinds of honorific nouns and verbs, as well as how verbs are conjugated into honorific forms. We'll also learn how we can address our friends, as well as those who are higher than us in the hierarchy. Finally, we'll learn how we can be respectful when using Korean in specific settings, such as when we're saying goodnight, when we talk about meeting people, and when we talk about taking someone to a particular place. By the end of this course, the aim is for you to have a clear idea of how you can speak Korean with your friends, as well as those who are higher up in the hierarchy. All our lessons on honorific language in context include series of guided speaking practices, and each lesson comes with worksheets so that you can review what you learned in the lessons. Now, this course is not for absolute beginners, so you do need to have a working knowledge of Hangul and basic awareness of Korean sentence structure. Okay, so if you're keen to master how formal language is used in Korea, come and join the course. I'll see you soon in the lesson. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, in this lecture I'm going to explain how this course is structured so that you have a better idea of how to navigate this course and so that you have a better understanding of how your learning is going to be structured. So let's go over the 3 core units of this course. The following unit, Unit 2, is on hierarchy in Korea. In this unit, we'll first briefly go over what formal language is in Korean and how we use language with people in different levels of hierarchy. Then we'll take a look at how hierarchy is established in different settings. And although the most important element in establishing hierarchy is age, in certain settings, such as in families, at work, and at school, there are other factors that come into play. So we'll take a look at all these different factors in detail. Unit 3 is on honorific language, and in this unit we'll learn more about different kinds of honorific language. Now there are specific honorific nouns and verbs which are different from their standard forms. So we'll take a look at these in detail, and there will also be a handout with a comprehensive list of honorific nouns and verbs, which you can review in your own time. After that, we will learn how to conjugate verbs into honorific forms. Not all verbs have separate honorific forms. Some can be conjugated into honorific forms by adding she, and we'll take a look through different patterns of verb conjugation in detail. Finally, in this unit, we will learn how to address our peers and how to address those higher than us in the hierarchy. In Unit 4, we'll look at how we use language in different situations with different people. We'll learn about honorific language used to talk about asking questions, giving something to someone, and taking someone to a particular place. And by going over how language is used in different settings, it'll help to improve your overall understanding of how honorific language is used in Korea. Each lesson is accompanied with worksheets, so please download the worksheets so that you can review what you learned and practice writing the sentences from the lesson. Okay, so that's the overview of the whole course, and the next lesson is the first lesson on the unit on hierarchy in Korea. And we'll first take a look at what formal language is. I'll see you soon in that lesson. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, so in this unit we're going to go over what formal language is in Korean And we're also going to learn various cultural aspects which affects how and why we use formal and informal language in Korea. Now, Korean language can be categorized into either 반말, which means informal, or 존댓말, which means formal/respectful. 반 means half, and 말 means words or speech. So the literal meaning of 반말 doesn't make much sense. But 반말 refers to language we use with those who are of equal standing, or when we can talk down to people, particularly to those who are younger than us. On the other hand, in 존댓말, 존댓 comes from the word 존대, which means respect. So this phrase 존댓말 refers to language we use to be respectful. The words 반 and 존대 come from Chinese characters, and there are equivalent native Korean phrases, which are 낮춤말 and 높임말. 낮춤 comes from the word 낮추다, which means to lower. And 높임 comes from the word 높이다, which means to elevate. However, these phrases are less commonly used than 반말 and 존댓말. So the important question we need to consider is why we have these two types of language. And the reason why we have 반말 and 존댓말 is because of the Korean culture, which is heavily influenced by Confucianism. Now, we won't go into Confucianism in too much detail, but one of the key tenets of Confucianism is respect for age and authority. And to this day, it's an integral part of Korean society and culture. Now, the influence of Confucianism has led to the Korean society becoming highly hierarchical. Those who are older than us and those in position of authority, such as teachers and supervisors at work, are higher up in the hierarchy. And when we are with people with seniority, we have to use appropriate language, and we also have to behave appropriately. For example, in Korea, young people are not allowed to smoke cigarettes with older people. And if you want to have a cigarette when you're with older people, you have to excuse yourself and have a cigarette somewhere else. It's considered extremely rude to smoke together with people you should be respectful to. You can, however, smoke with people higher up in the hierarchy if they allow you to. These changes in our behavior, as well as the language we use, is incredibly important. If you don't keep to these social norms, then you're basically considered to be a very rude person, and it will be hard to maintain good relations with others. So the next important question is how this hierarchy is established. And there are different factors that come into play depending on the setting of the hierarchy, such as social, family, and workplace. However, the most important factor in establishing hierarchy in Korea is age. Now, age is the single most important factor, largely because it's one common denominator among all of us. But as we will find out, in certain settings, such as workplace, one's position or role within that setting is more important than age. Now, we will explain how hierarchy is established in different settings, but before we do that, in the next lecture, we'll take a look at how age is calculated in Korea and how it's used to establish social hierarchy. So I'll see you soon again in the next lecture. Bye-bye. Hi everyone, so in this lesson, we're going to learn about the Korean age system. Now, it might seem a little strange, but age is calculated differently in Korea compared to other countries. And the age system used in Korea is referred to as East Asian age reckoning. This age system originated from China, and while many other East Asian countries such as Japan have abandoned the system, it's still the common age system used in Korea. This age system is based on two key factors. One is that as soon as you're born, you are a year old. And this is because this age system counts the time spent in the mother's womb, which is less than a full year, but it's roughly calculated as being 1 year. So once the baby is born, the baby instantly becomes a year old. The second important factor is that for the calendar year in which the baby is born, the baby is 1. And at the turn of the next year, the baby, as well as everyone else in Korea, becomes a year older. So regardless of when your birthday is, the whole population of Korea becomes a year older together in the new year. So this means that a baby born on December 31st is a year old for less than 24 hours and is then 2 on January 1st. And technically this will be correct, but when Koreans refer to baby's age, we tend to talk about their age in months rather than in years, which I think is quite similar in most other countries. So the two important points to note are 1, you are 1 when you are born, and 2, you become a year older at the turn of the following year. And this is the age system that determines social hierarchy in Korea. In Korea, those who are born in the same year as you are considered as your peers. Those who are older have seniority, and you have seniority over those who are younger than you. So if you were born in 1990, you need to be respectful towards those born in 1989 or earlier. And to those born in 1991 and later, you can be more casual as you are older than them. And the key thing to note is that even if they're only a month older than you, let's say that you were born in January and you meet someone born in December of the previous year, then you have to be respectful to that person born in the previous year, even though that person is only a month older. Because of this, in Korea, you can only be friends with those who are born in the same year as you, and you can never truly be friends with those who are older or younger, since you can never be equal in that relationship. Also, because of these reasons, quite often in Korea, rather than asking how old someone is, Koreans often ask each other what year they were born in. So if you were born in 1990, you can say 90년생. 90 refers to the year, 년 means year, and 생 means birth. When we say the year we're born in, we use Sino-Korean numbers. So do keep this in mind and don't be surprised if a Korean person asks what year you were born in, because they're trying to work out your age and where you fit in the social hierarchy. Now, one other key factor that influences how we use language in Korea is how familiar we are with certain people. If we have close relations with people, we can use more informal language, whereas if we aren't familiar with people, it's very important to use formal language. So I might know someone who's 5 years older than me, but because I've known that person my entire life, I will actually use 반말 with that person. Whereas if I meet someone who's only 2 years older than me, but I've only known that person for a month, then it's important for me to use 존댓말. Now, this aspect of familiarity and language use is something I will discuss in more detail later in this unit. Now, although the Korean age system is the main age system we use to establish social hierarchy, the Western age system is also used in Korea. It's mainly used to state certain age requirements, such as medical procedures where the patient has to be of a certain age, and also when referring to certain legal age requirements, such as for driving, drinking, and marriage. And to refer to this Western age, we use the word 만. So if we say 만 18살, then it means 18 years old in Western age. And if we say 만 16살, then it means 16 in Western age. So while Korean age system is the main age system that is used in everyday situation, and it's the one that we use to establish hierarchy when we meet people, when we need to be more precise, especially with certain legal age requirements, we use the Western age system. Okay, so I hope you now have a pretty good understanding of how Korean age system works and how it's used to establish social hierarchy in Korea. Over the next few lessons, we're going to look at how hierarchy is established in specific settings. And in the next lesson, we're going to look at hierarchy in schools. See you then. Bye-bye. Hi everyone. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how hierarchy is established at school. Now, although age is the most important factor in establishing social hierarchy, there are other factors that influence establishing hierarchy in other settings. Now, there are two key relationships at school. One is between the teacher and the student, and the other is between students. The relationship between teachers and students is simple to understand. Teachers are in the position of authority, so they have seniority. And in most settings, they are also older than the students. So this relationship is simple to understand. However, in educational settings with mature students, the teacher can be younger than the students, such as in yoga classes or at language schools. And in these settings, although the teacher has seniority, he or she has to be mindful and respectful of the fact that the students are older. And conversely, the students also have to be respectful of the teacher's position, even if they are younger. And in general, these relationships work out fine, but it is something people need to be mindful of. Now, in terms of the relationship between students, the hierarchy is established based on year groups, which is called 학년. And in primary and secondary schools, this is fairly straightforward as students tend to mix with their year group, and students in each year group tend to be of the same age. Those in year groups above are older and are called 선배, and those in year groups below are younger and are called 후배. The concept of 선배 and 후배 is really important in Korea. They're rather difficult to translate in English, but 선배 refers to someone with more experience than you, and 후배 is someone with less experience. The terms 선배 and 후배 are not limited in their use in school settings. They can also be used in other settings, such as at workplace. Now, students in the same year group in primary and secondary schools tend to use 반말 as soon as they meet. And they'll also use 반말 to their 후배 and use 존댓말 to their 선배. So hierarchy is fairly straightforward in primary and secondary schools. However, things get a little complicated when we start looking at year groups in universities. At universities in Korea, seniority is also based on year group, and the year group at university is called 학번. It's similar to the phrase class of in the US, but 학번 refers to the year you started university rather than the year you graduate in. So if you started university in 1998, then you are 98학번. And if you started university in 2008, then you are 08학번. We use Sino-Korean numbers and refer to the year by stating the numbers in single digits. Now, same as in primary and secondary schools, those who start the university before you have seniority, and they are called 선배. And you have seniority over those that start the university after you, who are called 후배. And those who are in your 학번 are called 동기. And 동기 refers to someone who begins something at the same time as you. And we can use 동기 in other settings, such as workplace. Now, most students in each 학번 tend to be of the same age. But for various reasons, there are some students who might be older. And one of the most common reasons is because some students retake the university entrance exam, which is called 수능. And they do this so that they can go to a better university. These students who retake 수능 are called 재수생. 재수 is the noun that refers to retaking 수능, and 생, as in 학생, refers to the student. So 재수생 means repeating student. When 재수생 enters university, they are generally in 학번, where most other students are a year younger. Nevertheless, they are the 재수생's 동기, so they are 재수생's friends. And those in 학번 from the previous year who are of the same age as 재수생 are 선배. So this has the potential of becoming a problem. 재수생 might find it difficult to be friends with those who are younger, or 재수생 might find it difficult to be respectful to those who are of the same age. And those 선배 who are well aware of the situation might get a bit abusive and upset the 재수생. And problems in relationships can occur time to time. When these situations arise, it requires the student to use a bit of common sense to ensure problems are avoided. And I think Korean students do try hard to make sure everyone feels comfortable in such situations. So do keep in mind that although age is the single most important factor in establishing hierarchy in Korea, in certain settings, such as at school, there are also other factors to consider, such as 학번. Okay, so let's now move on, and in the next lesson, we're going to look at how hierarchy is established in families. See you then. Bye-bye. Hi there. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the hierarchy levels in families. Okay, so let's first take a look at this family tree chart. Now, in general, the level of hierarchy is quite easy to understand in families. The family hierarchy is exactly the way it's shown in this chart. Let's say that this is me, so this means that those above me are higher up in the hierarchy, and those below me are lower in the hierarchy. For those in the same level, such as my siblings and my cousins, the hierarchy is established through age, so it's fairly simple to understand. Now, when it comes to how we use 반말 and 존댓말 in families, it depends on a couple of key factors. First, it depends on the family culture. Every family has its own culture. Some families have a very conservative culture, and then there are families that are very progressive and easygoing. And the language used in these families can differ quite significantly. Also, another key factor with families is that unlike in other settings where you've only just met someone or you've known someone for a short time, families have known each other for a very long time, and in many cases, their entire lives. As such, in many families, it's not unusual for parents and their children to use 반말 to each other, or grandchildren to use 반말 with their grandparents. So the use of language can be more casual between family members. So overall, family hierarchy is simple to understand, and between family members, the language used can be quite casual, though it can depend on the family culture. However, one scenario in which this orderly hierarchy gets thrown into a bit of chaos is when someone gets married and a new family member joins. For example, let's imagine that I'm 35 years old and my younger sister is 32. Now, I marry someone who's 29 and my younger sister marries a man who's 38. Now, in this situation, the position of those new to the family is dependent on their partner's position. So my wife, who's 3 years younger than my sister, has seniority over her because she's married to me, who is higher up in the hierarchy than my sister. And I have seniority over my brother-in-law, even though he's 3 years older, because he's married to my younger sister. Now, in general, this is not a big issue, and the proper thing to do is to disregard the age difference and accept one's position in the family tree. However, depending on the people involved, this can lead to problems in people's relationships, and quite often Korean dramas play on this and show conflicts related to these situations, which I guess can make for a more entertaining storyline. Okay, so that's it for this lesson on hierarchy of relationships in families, which are quite simple to understand. And remember that language used in families is dependent on the hierarchy, closeness of family members, and the family culture. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the level of hierarchy in workplace. See you then. Bye-bye. Hi everyone. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the hierarchy levels in workplace. Now, the level of hierarchy at workplace is all about one's job title. There are some common job titles which are used in Korean corporate environments, and these are used uniformly in all Korean companies, though depending on the nature of the industry the company operates in, they may differ slightly. So these are 신입 사원, new employee, and 신입 means a newcomer, and 사원 means an employee. Then we have 사원, employee. After that, you become 대리, which means an assistant manager. And next, we have 과장, which means manager. After that, we have 차장 and 부장, and they are deputy head of department and head of department. This syllable 장 comes from Chinese, and it refers to the head or the chief. Another title that's often used to refer to the head of department is 실장. Above that, we have 이사, which means director, and then we have 상무 and 전무. And they kind of refer to vice presidents, but they can also refer to other C-level type of roles, such as CFO or CTO. Lastly, we have 사장 and 회장, which refer to the CEO and the chairman. The word 사장 is also often used to refer to business owners. So if you want to speak to the owner of a restaurant, you can ask to speak to 사장님. Okay, so that's a general overview of the job titles in Korea. But as times have evolved, Korean companies have also adopted other job titles, and the most common one is 팀장, which means team leader. In Korean companies, if you're addressing a supervisor by their job title, it's important to add 님 at the end. So if you're a 사원 and you want to address your manager, then you have to say 과장님, 부장님, or 차장님, depending on who you're addressing. However, if you're addressing a subordinate, Koreans will add the person's surname in front of the job title. So if you're a 과장, you can address your 대리 by saying 김대리 or 이대리, depending on his or her surname. Now, similar to how students starting the school at the same time are called 동기, new employees joining the company at the same time are also referred to as 동기. And 동기s at workplace tend to refer to each other by adding 씨 at the end of names when they first join the company. In general, we use 씨 to address people who are either of equal level or with those who are below us in the hierarchy. We don't use 씨 when addressing people with seniority. Now, in terms of language used at workplace, it's important to recognize that workplace is a very formal setting. And whenever you speak to your supervisors, you will need to use the formal form of 존댓말, which means that most of what you say will end in 입니다, 씁니다, and so on. And with those in the same level as you, even if you're close to that person, it's important to use 존댓말, but in its polite form, as you need to be respectful to each other at work. Now, there are certain work environments where language use can be more casual, partly because of the corporate culture, but partly because of the personality of individuals. However, in general, language use at work is quite formal. Now, most of the time in Korea, those higher up in the corporate hierarchy tend to be older than those beneath them. And in the past, Korean companies intentionally only promoted people when they reached a certain age, which would help to avoid any issues that can arise from the conflict between job title and age. However, in modern times, things are changing, and there are people in management roles who are younger than the people they're managing. Now, while this is nothing new to people in other cultures, for many Korean people, this is an extremely uncomfortable situation. And I know many Korean men who would be extremely unhappy to work for an immediate supervisor who is younger than them. So this is a very sensitive situation. Now, this concept of hierarchy being established through positions in organizational structure is very common in Korea. And perhaps one other setting where it's also common is in the army, which is compulsory for all Korean men. However, we won't go into this in too much detail, as I think the army hierarchy based on rank is probably quite similar in most other countries around the world. Okay, so over the last few lessons, we have considered how hierarchy is established in various settings through factors other than age. And in this lesson, we focused on hierarchy in the workplace. In the next lesson, we'll consider how language use changes depending on how familiar with different people. See you soon again. Bye-bye. Hi there. So in this lesson, we're going to look at the influence of familiarity on language use. Now, before we go into this, it's important to note that children as well as teenagers use 반말 with their peers as soon as they meet. They will of course use 존댓말 if there is an age gap, but among peers, they will use 반말 with each other instantly. However, when two adults meet socially, even if there is an age gap, they will start off by using 존댓말. For example, even though I'm 40 years old, if I meet someone who's 30, when I first greet this person, I will use 존댓말. And the same applies if two adults of the same age meet. They will start off by using 존댓말. And the main reason for this is because they don't know each other well. So at the start of a relationship, two adults will use 존댓말. And as the relationship builds and they form close relations, they will transition to using 반말. And how they do this differs depending on whether the two people are of the same age or whether there is an age gap. Let's first consider relationships where two people are of the same age. Imagine that two 30-year-olds meet through a mutual friend. They'll first start off by using 존댓말. But after meeting each other a couple of times, they're familiar with each other, and one of them might say, 우리 말 놓을까? 우리 말 놓을까? Now, we learned earlier that 말 means words or speech, and the verb 놓다 means to let go. So the literal meaning, to let go of speech, doesn't make much sense. But this phrase means to let go of the formality between the two people and start using informal language. And between two people of the same age, either person in the relationship could suggest using informal language. And they could even suggest this when they meet for the first time, and it wouldn't be a problem. However, things change when there is an age gap in the relationship. When two people with an age gap meet, they still start off using 존댓말. And how they transition from using 존댓말 to 반말 depends on how big the age gap is. If the age gap is only a few years, then the older person might start using 반말 after meeting the younger person 2 or 3 times. And the younger person might start using 반말 with the older person maybe after 6th or 7th meeting. But this depends on how close they have gotten and whether the older person is the type of person who would be happy for the younger person to use casual language to them. Now, if the age gap is really big, let's say about 10 years, then even if they become really close, the younger person will likely have to continue using 존댓말. And the older person might use 반말 to the younger person at the second or the third meeting. Quite often, the younger person might say, 말 놓으세요. 말 놓으세요. And we use this sentence to suggest the older person to speak comfortably, and this is a way of being polite to the older person. One other factor to consider is that women tend to transition from formal to informal language much more quickly than men, even if there is an age gap. And in general, men in Korea tend to be more formal than women, which is why almost all men call their parents by the formal words 어머니 and 아버지, while women tend to call their parents by the informal forms 엄마 and 아빠. Final point to note in this lesson is that even if people have formed close relationships, in some relationships the language used has to be formal. For example, in relationships between teachers and students, although teachers can use 반말 to the students, students can never use 반말 to their teachers. Another common example is in the relationship between workers and their supervisors. Depending on the corporate environment, the supervisor might use 반말 to the workers, but workers can never use 반말 to their supervisors. So do keep that in mind. Okay, so that's it for this lesson on familiarity and language use. And the key point to note is that when people meet, they start off using 존댓말. And once they get to know each other, they can transition to using 반말, though how this is done depends on the age gap in the relationship, people's gender, and the nature of their relationship. Okay, so we've spent a lot of time developing our understanding of how hierarchy is established in Korea. In the next unit, we're going to start learning about different kinds of honorific language and how we use them. See you then. Bye-bye. Hi everyone. So in this unit, we're going to learn what honorific language is, how it's used, and we'll also look at how we can address people. In this lesson, we're going to look at the overview of honorific language. Now, as we have learned in the previous unit, because Korea is a hierarchical society, it's very important that we use appropriate language when we speak to people in different levels of hierarchy. In the previous unit, we learned that Korean language can be categorized into 반말 and 존댓말. 반말 is the language we use when we talk to our peers, and 존댓말 is the language we use when we talk to those with seniority. Within 존댓말, there are various layers, and the highest level of 존댓말 is what we call honorific language. Due to the nature of the Korean society, where respect is an integral aspect of how we interact with each other, use of honorific language is very common, and in many situations, it's more common than other forms of 존댓말. Two main forms of honorific language are nouns and verbs. A good example of an honorific noun is the word for name. In Korean, we have the standard word 이름 and an honorific form 성함. And we can use the honorific form when we refer to the name of someone who's higher up in the hierarchy. Now, not all nouns have standard and honorific words, and it's actually limited to certain words. In the resources section, you can find a document with a full list of nouns that have honorific forms. Now, the use of honorific verbs is much more widespread and more common in Korean. Some verbs have an entirely different honorific verbs, and a good example of this is the verb to give. The standard form is 주다, and its honorific form is 드리다. And similar to nouns, only a selection of verbs have a different honorific form. And again, we have a document with a full list of verbs and their honorific forms. However, one difference between nouns and verbs is that all Korean verbs can conjugate into an honorific form by adding 시 to the verbs. And this is something we will look at in detail in this unit. Now, in general, the most important aspect of honorific language is the use of verbs. So over the next few lessons, we'll take a look at the use of verbs in their honorific form in more detail. And in the next lesson, we'll take a look at the overview of Korean verbs. See you then. Bye-bye. Hi there. So in this lesson, we're going to take a look at the overview of Korean verbs. The infinitive forms of all Korean verbs and descriptive verbs, which function like adjectives, consist of the verb stem and 다. Here are some examples. 알다, to know. 자다, to sleep. 나쁘다, to be bad. 좋다, to be good. The red parts indicate the verb stem. In Korean, we generally use the infinitive forms when we talk about things in a matter-of-fact way. So we often see verbs' infinitive forms used in textbooks, and we generally don't use the infinitive form when we're talking to people. Now, these four verbs can be conjugated into 반말 and 존댓말, and these are the casual form, these are the polite forms, and then we have the formal form. As we learned before, whether we use 반말 or 존댓말 depends on who we're talking to in the hierarchy, the setting of that hierarchy, and the level of familiarity in our relationship. We generally use casual language with our peers or when we're talking down to people. And the polite form is what we use the most in everyday situation. When we meet people for the first time, when we talk to older family members, and when we're out shopping, ordering food in restaurants, or buying tickets at cinema, we can use the polite form. So this is the most commonly used verb form. Lastly, we have the formal form, and we use the formal form in very formal settings. And a good example is the workplace. Okay, so these are the three standard forms of verbs and descriptive verbs and how they're used. However, as mentioned in the previous lecture, as well as these forms, we also have another form of 존댓말, and this is the honorific form. And here are the honorific forms of these verbs. Again, as we learned before, some verbs have a completely different honorific verb, such as 자다 and 주무시다, but many verbs can be conjugated into honorific forms, and these are made by adding either 시 or 의시. Additionally, these honorific forms can be conjugated into casual, polite, and formal forms. The basis of how we use these three forms of honorific verbs is the same as the standard verbs. We will take a look at how we use honorific verbs in more detail later. Okay, so that's a quick overview of different forms of verbs and honorific verbs. Over the next 2 lessons, we're going to take a look at how we add 시 and 의시 to form honorific verbs. So I'll see you soon again in the next lesson. Bye-bye. Hi there, so in this lesson, we're going to learn how verbs are conjugated into honorific forms by adding 의시. Here's the first pattern. If the verb stem ends in a 받침, then we add 의시 to the verb stem. Here are some examples. 찾다, 찾으시다. 섞다, 섞으시다. 닫다, 닫으시다. So as you can see in these examples, when the verb stem ends in a 받침, we add 의시 to the verb stems to form honorific verbs. Now, when we add 의시 to the verb stem, they are considered as part of the verb stem. So they can conjugate into casual, polite, and formal forms in the same way as other verbs where the verb stem ends in the vowel E. For example, the verb 치다 means to hit, and it conjugates into 쳐, 쳐요, and 칩니다. Similarly, these 3 honorific verbs can be conjugated into their casual, polite, and formal forms in the same way. To form casual verbs, the vowel E changes to 여, and for the polite form, we add 요 at the end. To form the formal form, we change 시다 to 십니다. We will talk more about how we use these different forms of honorific verbs in a couple of lectures. Now, these honorific forms follow the same pattern of conjugation in the past and future tense. So the past tense of 치다 is 쳤어요, and the future tense is 칠 거예요. And these verbs change in the same way. So for the past tense, we have 찾으셨어요, 섞으셨어요, and 닫으셨어요. And for the future tense, we have 찾으실 거예요, 섞으실 거예요, and 닫으실 거예요. Okay, so let's now look at the second pattern. When a verb stem doesn't end in a 받침, we add 시 to the verb stem. Here are some examples. 치다, 치시다. 주다, 주시다. 사다, 사시다. And the way we change these verbs into casual, polite, and formal forms is exactly the same, as the verb stems still end in the vowel E. And these verbs can change into past and future forms in the same way too. One thing to note is that although the verb 주다 has a different honorific verb 드리다, we can still change 주다 to an honorific verb 주시다. We will talk more about how these verbs are used later in the course. Now, these are the 2 main patterns of adding 의시 to the verb stems to make the verbs into honorific verbs. Do make sure to download the exercise worksheet to practice forming honorific forms following these patterns. Now, there are also other irregular patterns of changing verbs into honorific verbs, so that's what we'll look at in the following lesson. See you then. Bye-bye. Hi there, so in this lesson, we're going to learn about irregular patterns of adding 의시 to form honorific verb forms. The first irregular pattern is in verbs where the verb stem ends in a 리을 받침. In these verbs, we remove the 리을 받침 and add 시 to the verb stem. Here are some examples. 살다, 사시다. 알다, 아시다. 팔다, 파시다. So as you can see in these examples, we remove the 리을 받침 in the verb stem and then add 시 to the verb stem. And the way these honorific verbs change into casual, polite, and formal forms, as well as past and future tense, is the same as what we saw in the previous lesson. However, there are 2 exceptions to this pattern. 갈다, 가르시다. 말다, 마르시다. So in these examples, we follow the pattern from the previous lesson where we add 의시 to the verb stems ending in a 받침. Now, there is no real reason for this, but I think it's largely to avoid confusion since 가시다 is an honorific form of 가다, and 마시다 is a verb meaning to drink. So do keep in mind that there are certain exceptions even to irregular patterns. Now, another irregular pattern with honorific verb conjugation is when the verb stem ends in a 비읍 받침. When the verb stem ends in a 비읍 받침, we remove the 비읍 and then add 우시 to the verb stem. Here are two examples. 눕다, 누우시다. 아름답다, 아름다우시다. So as you can see, the 비읍 받침 is removed, and then we add 우시 to the verb stem. Also, the way we change them into different levels of formality and tenses is exactly the same as the verb stem ends in the vowel E. However, as before, there is always an exception to the rule, and one exception to this pattern is in the verb 잡다. The honorific form of 잡다 is 잡으시다, and this follows the same pattern we learned in the previous lesson, where we add 으시 to the verb stems ending in a 받침. So this is one exception to this pattern of verb stems ending in 비읍 받침. Okay, so that's it for this lesson on irregular patterns to form honorific verb forms. Please download the worksheet to practice the irregular patterns you have learned in this lesson. In the next lesson, we're going to focus on how we use honorific verbs. See you then. Bye-bye.